Who has held the oceans in his hands? Who has numbered every grain of sand? Kings and nations tremble at his voice. All creation rises to rejoice. Who has given counsel to the Lord? Who can question any of his words? Who can teach the one who knows all things? Who can fathom all his wondrous deeds? Behold, our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold, our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. Who has felt the nails upon his hand, bearing all the guilt of sinful man? God eternal, humble to the grave, Jesus Savior, risen now to reign. Behold, our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold, our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. You will reign forever. You will reign forever. You will reign forever. You will reign forever. Behold, our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold, our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. Behold, our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold, our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him.
When I started teaching at Freed Hardeman 8 years ago, it's hard to believe it's been 8 years, I was 32 years old, which means from a senior at Freed Hardeman to my age, it was only about 10 years. And it didn't really feel like that much of a distance. Right? It's like 10 years. I'm only 10 years older than some of these guys. I felt a little bit of a closer connection. In fact, it was strange. There were a couple of students I remember having in class that were siblings of people that I went to school with. 8 years later, there are no more siblings of people that I went to school with. In fact, 8 years later, that distance between my age and their age feels a lot different. It feels a lot bigger. In fact, we're getting to the point now where there are some children of people that I went to school with who are almost about to come to Freed Hardeman. And there's been a case or two where they started pretty early, and I'm with people who were seniors when I was a freshman. Their kids have shown up, and that makes you feel old, for lack of better terms. And I know some of you are like, you're not old, what are you talking about? But all of us grapple with that ongoing progression through life and the progression that we feel with our age. There's a wedding that I'm doing here in 3 or 4 weeks of some of our students, and every time I talk to the dad of one of these people who's getting married, he always calls me sir. He's a dad of a student, right? But when I look at him, I don't know how old he is, but it sure feels like he's younger than me. He looks younger than me. And that really makes me kind of grapple with my age and complexities of that sort of thing. Back in the fall, I played softball, intramural softball for the first time in 4 or 5 years. It's been a busy 4 or 5 years, and so I hadn't played. Played 4 or 5 years ago, played again this time. And there were 4 or 5 baseball coaches on the team and graduate assistants. And they were the young guys, mid-20s, really, really good. And then there were several of us who were faculty and staff who were a little bit older. And it dawned on me at one point during the season, on the faculty staff softball team, I was the oldest guy on the team. And that hurt my feelings a little bit, I admit. The last game of the season, I decided, you know what, I'm gonna let loose a little bit. And the one thing that I could always do athletically pretty good was throw a baseball, throw a ball hard and far. And so I thought, man, this is the last game of the season, I'm gonna let loose. And I did. And there were some students who were like, ooh, look at that. You know how my arm felt the next day? It felt like it was gonna fall off of my body. And that was one of those moments again that I thought, wow, I am not as young as I used to be. I've never had back or neck problems until the past year, right? It's something about 40, they say, that you hit it, and man, things change a little bit, and it's the case with my back or my neck at least. Some of you, again, are thinking, oh, shut up, Matt, shut up. You have no reason to be talking about this. But all of us wrestle with this some, the complexities of aging. When you hit 30, that happens. All of a sudden, it's like, whoa, I'm not in my 20s anymore. And even when you hit 20 and you're not a teenager anymore, and then on up the line, we all struggle with this. The good news this morning is that we are not the first people to wrestle with the complexities of aging. Obviously, people have always done that, but even in Scripture, this happens. If you have your Bibles, turn them to Ecclesiastes chapter 11. Some of you may be wondering, hey, I thought we were walking through Acts. Well, long ago, I planned for us to take a break because it's a holiday weekend. I figured we'd have people in and out and guests, so we're stepping away from Acts for a week. And we're going to jump into Ecclesiastes for just a minute. Ecclesiastes, to be completely honest, is a really weird book. If you've ever studied it, it is morbid and it is dark, and some of it is kind of hard to understand. But the big idea is the writer's trying to find meaning in life. And he goes through all of these different phases or parts of life to try to find that meaning. He talks about work and success and pleasure and money. And he says you can't really find true meaning in any of those things. In fact, he says they're all vanity. And you know the conclusion of Ecclesiastes, right? That true meaning in life is found only in relationship with God or submission to God. But in the middle of all that, he kind of takes a step away from some of those parts of life that are meaningless, and he asks some questions or thinks a little bit about aging. And he talks specifically to young people. In the passage, you're going to see the word youth several times. But it forces all of us to ask the question, what do we do with our age? How should we think about progressing through the phases of life? Now, some of you are going to think, well, that's kind of depressing to even think about that. And Ecclesiastes, just up front, we'll say some of what we're going to read today is depressing. Why should we do that? I think the reason this is valuable is because of what the psalmist says in Psalm 90, verse 12. Moses, the text says, wrote this one, or the heading says, wrote this one. So teach us to number our days. That's what we're doing when we think about life and aging, right? We're numbering our days. We're thinking about where we've been and how much we've got left. What's the value of that? Here's what Moses says. Teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. When we think about life and the progression of phases of life, it's good for us, it's worth it, because it helps to make us wise. But it also forces us to ask some tough questions. And this passage forces us to ask some tough questions. For those of you who consider yourself to be young, how can you enjoy the days of your youth, your earlier years when maybe you have a little more time, a little more energy, and life is a little bit easier? How can you enjoy that while still honoring God? And for those of us who are progressing through life a little bit more, how do we continue to enjoy life while acknowledging that time is fading away and things are changing? And how do you enjoy life while recognizing that and still honoring God? And for those of you who are even older, some of you you're asking, how do I make the most of this period of my life? How do I find meaning in right now, regardless of what phase of life I'm in? And those are tough questions, but we're not left alone to answer those questions. The text helps us with that. So Ecclesiastes chapter 11, we're going to pick up in verse 7. This is where most scholars believe the text should be divided. Verse 7, Light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. When I read this verse, you know what day I think about? I think about a day just like today. Today's one of those days, low 70s, the sun is bright. Man, it is beautiful. This is one of those days it's easy to say, life is good. This is nice. And I think that's the kind of thought that the writer here has. It's life is good, and it's easy to enjoy the blessings of God and see the blessings of God on a day like today when it's light and it's sunny. And so he says, if that's the case, if life is good and a gift from God, and then here's what we ought to do, verse 8. So if a person lives many years, let him rejoice in them all. Wait, Matt, no. We're supposed to be serious and somber and make it not about this earth. This world is not my home, we sing. Well, here's what the writer of Ecclesiastes says. If you live a long time, enjoy them. Rejoice in the time that you have on this earth. We're allowed to enjoy it. But here's the warning, and here's where it gets a little negative. But let him remember that the days of darkness will be many. Now, this is probably, we don't know for sure, probably referring to death. So yeah, you better enjoy it while you have it, because once the end comes, well, that's a long time, right? The days of darkness are many. All that comes is vanity, he says. The word there, vanity, literally means meaningless. It's not hard to look around our world and see a lot of meaninglessness, right? I mean, in fact, if you focus on that, what's going to happen? If you focus on all the meaninglessness that's around us, all the waste that's around us, it can get really discouraging and disturbing. And so if we're going to rejoice in all the days that we have, we've got to be intentional. With all of the vanity and meaninglessness that's around us, we've got to be intentional in rejoicing in the days that we do have. Now he's going to focus on the younger people, all right? So if you consider yourself younger, tune into this. This is specifically written to you. Watch this, verse 9. In fact, I'm going to put this verse on the screen. Rejoice, O young man, there it is, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and the sight of your eyes. Listen, to those of you who are younger, here is biblical permission to enjoy life. To enjoy the days that you have when you've got a little more energy and you've got a little bit more time. Now, we don't always model this very well. And we've kind of made it sound like if you're going to be a follower of Jesus, then you've got to be miserable. That you can't have any fun, that you can't enjoy. Well, you know, that's false. And anytime we lean in that direction, we're going against what Scripture teaches. Of course we're supposed to honor God, and of course there's times to be serious and reverent, but the writer of Ecclesiastes reminds us that when you're young, that's a time to enjoy life and enjoy the energy and the youth that you have. Now, as you read this next part, walk in the ways of your heart and the sight of your eyes, I don't know about you, but when I first read that doesn't sound very biblical, does it? Because I can think of some other verses that seem to oppose that. For example, in the law, God gives the law and he says, I want you to wear a little tassel on your sleeves. And that's weird, but that was part of the law. And here's the reason why. Numbers 15, verse 39. And it shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord. So you wear that little tassel to remember the commandments of the Lord. Why? To do them, not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes, which you are inclined to whore after. Now wait a second, we just read that we should follow our heart and our eyes. And then Moses says, don't do that. We shouldn't do that. So what's going on here? Well, I think the key to doing this well, to enjoying the days of our youth and walking in the ways of your heart and the sight of our eyes, is to listen to the caveats that this passage gives. Now, a caveat is kind of a fancy word for a stipulation or a regulation. So here's the command, here's what you can do, but here are a couple of stipulations to remember. So what's this text say? So the text says, young people, man, enjoy it, rejoice, let your heart cheer you, walk in the ways of your heart and the sight of your eyes, with these two caveats. Caveat number 1 is in the rest of verse 9. It says, but know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. All right, so you can enjoy your youth and have some fun and live adventurously. But you've got to remember as you do that you're gonna face judgment someday. And so enjoy it, enjoy life, enjoy your youth, but regulate that enjoyment with knowledge of God's final judgment. That sounds harsh, but we do that with about anything. Last fall, my son got invited to a redneck birthday party. For those of you who know Jared Clayton, it was Jared Clayton's kid, and it was bring your BB gun and wear camo. And so as you know, my family, we've got a lot of camo laying around. Or not, right? So you know what we did? I said, son, let's go buy a BB gun. So we went to Tractor Supply, bought a BB gun. Now, a BB gun can bring a lot of joy to an 8-year-old boy and his dad. But don't you think there are some stipulations and some regulations when I hand that BB gun over to God? Of course. There are things that I say, okay, every time even if I say, okay, you can go, I'm in the garage, you can go shoot your BB gun, there's some things I say, now remember, keep safety on, etc. There's some stipulations, and those regulations allow it to even be more fun, and people don't get hurt. This is kind of like that. Young people, enjoy the days of your youth. But just remember that you'll come into judgment someday. This past week, we did some really cool hikes and occasionally some dangerous places. And there was a time or two, 3 or 4 times, that before we set out on that hike, I looked at my kids, I gathered them up, I said, okay, guys, you have to listen to us. If I say, hold my hand, you will hold my hand. And if you misstep and you don't pay attention, you're going to fall off this mountain and you're going to die. Now you're like, ooh, but when you're about to go on a hike that you know if you take a couple steps the wrong direction, you could fall off the cliff and die, you're gonna lay out some regulations. Now, was it awesome and was it fun even though I put out some regulations and kind of laid the law down? I'm like, yeah, of course. And so you can enjoy life even with some regulations along the way. My kids called those sorts of places, they would look over and said, oh, that's a death fall. Yeah, again, that's kind of morbid. They called those sorts of places death falls. But we recognized if we were going to have fun, we had to have some regulations. Listen, you can enjoy your youth, but remember that ultimately you'll come into judgment, and that allows you to regulate it. Here's the second caveat. In fact, let's keep reading. Let's read verse 10. Remove vexation from your heart and put away pain from your body, for youth and the dawn of life are vanity. Now, we could stop there and say, this is kind of a side note. When you focus on the difficulty and the pain of life, when that's where you keep your focus, is it easy to get discouraged and down and depressed? Yeah. And so I think he's saying here, if you want to enjoy life, one of the things you're going to have to be intentional about is not focusing on the negative. And he says, all is vanity. There's a whole bunch of vanity and meaninglessness in our world. If we're going to keep our spirits up and live a joyful life and let our hearts cheer us, then we've got to be intentional about not focusing all the time on the negative. We don't always do a very good job at that sometimes, right? It's easy to focus on the negative. But here's the second caveat, chapter 12, verse 1. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth. And we'll stop there. To remember your Creator in the days, and if you grew up in church, you've heard this one, especially if you're a teenager, man. It's like one of those theme verses people throw at you. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. This isn't just mental assent to something. This isn't just saying, oh yeah, I remember God. This is about worldview. And can you imagine the young person, imagine 2 types of young people in our culture, right? So there's the teenager over here or college student over here who buys into our culture's worldview, which says you can do whatever you want to do, when you want to do it, it's all about me. And then there's the Christian worldview. There's the teenager or college student who remembers their Creator and they say, okay, this isn't just about me. Ultimately, I am a child of God. And that determines what I do and who I am and how I live. You see the difference in worldview, and you see the difference that can make in how one enjoys their teenage years or their college years. And some of you look back and say, you know what, I wish when I was in my teenage years or my 20s that I would have held a Christian worldview. Now the key here is not just to hold a Christian worldview, but to be around other people who hold this Christian worldview. That's going to make a pretty big difference. We'll come back to that in just a minute. And so maybe the way to say this is like you've heard it before. Remember who you are and whose you are. If you want to enjoy your youth, your teenage years, your 20s or 30s, whatever you think is young, if you want to enjoy that, you got to do what your parents said. Or somebody probably said to you along the way, remember who you are and whose you are. Now here's where things get a little dark, I guess you could say. So you can enjoy your youth. Do that. Remember these two caveats, right? In fact, I summarized them right here. Enjoy your youth, but regulate that enjoyment with knowledge of God's final judgment and knowledge of who you are. Before, chapter 12, verse 1 says this, before the evil days come and the years draw near of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. And then here's what's going to happen. I want you to see these verses. I'm going to read them with you. We're not going to try to explain it because the next few verses, man, people try to figure out exactly what they mean. Here's what they are. It's a poem about the challenges of old age and death. Now, when you read poetry, is poetry always literal? No, all right? So there's a lot of figurative stuff, and so we're kind of left with questions as to exactly what does that little piece of this mean? We're not going to go there. But as we read this, I think what you're going to see is it all kind of envisions this old house that is starting to crumble a bit. Hopefully you don't feel that way, but nonetheless, what it's about. Chapter 12, verse 2. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened, and the clouds return after the rain, in the day when the keepers of the house tremble, and the strong men are bent, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those who look through the windows are dimmed, and the doors on the street are shut when the sound of the grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. They are afraid also of what is high, and terrors are in the way. The almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails because man is going to his eternal home. And the mourners go about the streets, and listen to these metaphors for death. Before the silver cord is snapped, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. Wow, if you're looking for your feel-good verses of the week, there they are. The picture here is, okay, young people, enjoy it before it gets to this, right? Now, all of us have experienced likely an aging house to some degree, or at least a lot of us. At some point, problems, when you build a house or you have a new house, you move in a new house, everything looks good and shiny and nice, but over time, little things start falling apart, don't they? And over time, those little things start to mount up and bigger things, and then you sometimes have to do a complete rehaul or complete renovation. The writer of Ecclesiastes says it's kind of what the body is like. Man, it just kind of keeps going downhill and things get more and more difficult, which reminds us of what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 1. He describes our earthly bodies as a tent. It's just temporary. Now, what do you do with all of this? These are some difficult verses, kind of some weird verses. What do we do with this? Let me talk to those of you who are younger first. Here's what I think this passage communicates to us, and it's a reminder that I think we all need. That we must embrace and enjoy life as a gift from our Creator. Embrace and enjoy life as a gift from your Creator. Now, we talk a lot about obedience, and maybe you view your faith through obedience, and that's good. We must honor God through obedience. But sometimes we see obedience as this slavish existence to a mean and angry God. That is not what the Bible teaches. Yes, we're called to submission and obedience, but it's to a God who has gifted us a lot of good things, who's given us a beautiful world, and in this passage at least says, enjoy it. Enjoy this as a gift from my hands, my gracious and generous hands. And so if you're a younger person, absolutely, you are allowed. The Bible gives you permission to embrace and enjoy life as a gift from your Creator with a couple of caveats, right? Remember that whatever you do, that you'll come into judgment for it, and that kind of regulates what you do. And number two, remember who you are and whose you are. So that's the message specifically to those of you who are younger, in a passage that specifically targets the younger. But let me speak to all of you now. You know what I think this passage says to all of us, regardless of age or phase of life? The exact same thing. Embrace and enjoy life as a gift from your Creator. It doesn't matter how old you are, or how many days you might have left, or what's changed, or what's different. You're still called by God to embrace and enjoy life as a gift from a good and kind Creator. Now, what's this look like? How do we do this? Let me give you a couple of suggestions as to how to live this out, how to live out the message of Ecclesiastes 11 and 12. Number one, live life to the fullest. Now, I admit, this is not something you hear in church very often. Right? It sounds like a graduation speech, not a sermon. But I think that's what this passage teaches. There's a sense in which, as long as we are regulated by those caveats in chapter 11 and 12, that we are allowed and should live life to the fullest and enjoy the life that God has given us. And that looks different in different phases of life, doesn't it? For those of you who are older, what's it going to look like for you to live life to the fullest? Is it, well, I won't say what it is or is not, but you can think about that. For those of you who are younger, what's that going to look like? Maybe that means being adventurous, going out on a limb and doing things that you haven't done. Maybe it means leaving home and experiencing some things that you haven't experienced before. And those of you who are parents are like, stop it, shut up, don't talk about that. But it's true, isn't it, that this is an opportunity to live adventurously. For those of you who have done this sort of thing, you look back at your teens and 20s and you honored God, but you took some risks and you lived adventurously. You have any regrets about that? No, most people are like, I'd do it all over again. Travel abroad when you're in college, if you can find the loan money for it. You know, I can think of some people in this room who traveled abroad, probably took some loan money, maybe are still paying off those loans, but do you regret it? Not a bit. You live adventurously. You live life to the fullest. I think about, if you don't know Darby, you should meet Darby up here. Raise your hand. Hey, Darby. So Darby, 3 years ago, I actually looked it up on Instagram a few minutes ago. 3 years ago, she took 6 months to hike the entire Appalachian Trail. Now, you were kind of year after college, that sort of thing. It was probably the one time in your life that you could do something like that. Any regrets about that? No, I don't know if you have any broken, but that was challenging and hard. 6 months to hike the Appalachian Trail. That's living life to the fullest. That's living adventurously. And some of you are like, well, I can't do that. I don't have the time or the resources. That's fine. What's it going to look like for you to live life to the fullest and enjoy the beautiful world that God has given us? What's that going to look like for you? Secondly, you can enjoy life without guilt. You can enjoy life without guilt. Let me go back and tell you why one of the reasons I think we struggle with this. I think we struggle with this whole principle, and we haven't always been good examples of this for a couple of reasons recently. I think the past 18 months or 14 months, whatever it's been now, with COVID, has made this challenging for a couple of reasons. I think this has been challenging for some people. We haven't been good examples of this as Christians because we faced this with our teeth gritted. And we've either been struggled with fear or what, but I think a lot of us have struggled with just frustration and anger. Instead of saying, okay, whatever life throws at me, I'm going to take it and I'm going to live life to the fullest, even if that means things are different and things are changed. And yet sometimes I've seen a lot of Christians who've just been angry about all of this. Well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? We can live life to the fullest regardless of our circumstances. I think we also struggle with this. And I'll say this sensitively, I'll try to, because of our background. As members of churches of Christ, especially, we've been kind of taught, and it's been ingrained in us to get things right. And sometimes getting things right can kind of mean gritting our teeth and getting things right no matter what, right? And I think sometimes is getting things right important? Yeah, absolutely. We should get things right. But we can obey and honor God while still being joyful. Because sometimes we get so focused on getting things right that it sucks the joy out of everything. And we can't be that kind of people. We're called to be joyful people who enjoy the blessings God has given us. So we got to live life to the fullest. Secondly, we can enjoy life without guilt. Some of you may need that reminder. Some of you may have been raised in a kind of situation where if you do anything fun or something that's enjoyable, or you buy something, that you really should feel kind of guilty about that. And I think this passage reminds us that it is good and right to enjoy the things that God has given us. Here's how Paul says it. All right, so he says in 1 Timothy chapter 6, good quote first. Listen to this. And I don't throw long quotes at you too often, but listen to this. Provan says, why is it that so many religious people's lives are instead of living joyfully, are characterized by fear and defensiveness, by a joy-suppressing legalism that is more concerned to do the right thing than to revel in God's blessings. Now, if we stop there, you'd be like, oh, he's saying we shouldn't do the right thing. No, not at all. The writer is himself concerned of Ecclesiastes that people do the right thing. But the first and foremost right thing is to revere God as God. And we do not do this by suggesting through the way we live our lives that God is a mean-spirited and harsh tyrant. Sometimes by the way we live, and some Christians are just so miserable, they live as if to say God is mean and a harsh tyrant. He's a mean-spirited God. We do not honor God by proclaiming falsely in our attitudes and actions that He is the kind of person or God to create a wonderful world and then systematically to forbid His creatures to enjoy it. Do you believe that God created a wonderful and beautiful world? Do you believe that every blessing is from Him? Now, do you think that the same God who created all of this says, now, don't enjoy it? And if you happen to enjoy it, you ought to feel some guilt along the way. Doesn't make sense, does it? Here's the way Paul would say it. 2 Timothy, or 1 Timothy 6, as for the rich in this present age. Now, we can stop there, and I've done this before. Historically and in our current world, the vast majority of us are wealthy. Regardless of your situation, you compare yourself to the rest of history and the rest of our world today, we are the rich in this present world. Here's what Paul would say to us. Charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches. So don't put your hopes in your money or your stuff. Instead, on God. Now listen to this last phrase. Who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. Do you hear that? Everything that God has given richly is to be enjoyed. Like, we don't have to say, well, I can't enjoy anything because that's not the right. No. He says God has given us everything to enjoy it. Now, how can we do that while still honoring God? I think the answer is found right here. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. You want to enjoy the good things of God without feeling guilty? You want to do that the right way? Well, make sure that while you're enjoying what God has given you, that you're doing good. That you're not just being rich, but you're being rich in good works, that you're generous, and that you're ready to share. You ever known someone like that? I mean, they did some enjoyable, they did some cool things, but man, they were so generous. I think that's what Paul is saying here. You can enjoy what God has given you. But you got to be generous and rich in good works too. We can enjoy the good things of life without feeling guilty. Tomorrow, some of you are going to, as we remember what's happened historically in our nation and the sacrifices people have made, some of you are going to eat tomorrow, aren't you? Some of you are going to eat pretty well. Based on everything we've said up to this point, you know what I would say about that? Enjoy it. Enjoy that. Now I know for most of you are like, I wasn't worried about that. I'm sure we're going to enjoy it. But you can enjoy that good food as a blessing from God as long as you're generous and ready to share. Here's the third thing I would suggest. We've got to teach younger people the truths of this passage. For those of you who are older, who have children or grandchildren, teach those people this. If you don't know what to say or where to start, just take them to this passage. Because our young people need to know, because we haven't always modeled this well, that it's okay to enjoy the blessings that God has given us. But it's also good for them to hear some of the warnings of this passage about judgment and aging and death, as negative as some of those things may be. We've got to do a better job of teaching the next generation that it's okay to enjoy God's blessings with the regulations He's given us. I remember my senior year in college, I was put on a panel of Bible majors. It was kind of a strange thing. There were 4 or 5 of us that they put on a panel, and they put all the other Bible majors in the audience. And then they just did this back and forth Q&A thing and asked us questions about our experience to try to help those who are younger. And one of the questions they asked was, now that you're a senior, it was the end of our senior year, what would you do different? I don't remember what I said, but I remember one of the guys on the panel was probably, from an academic perspective, the best student among us. Studied all the time, great grades, and great guy. I mean, they didn't come any kinder or more humble than this guy. And so we all kind of looked up to him as just this leader. Again, very quiet, but just a great student. And in answer to the question, what would you do different? Here's what he said. He said, I would study less and have more fun like these guys. That was a guy saying, listen, I didn't get it all right. And there's some things I wish I could change. If you're older and there's some things that you haven't got right, please tell the rest of us. Tell those who are younger than you. We need your honesty. We don't just need to hear about the good old days and how great everything was. Well, it's okay maybe to talk about that some. We also need you to be honest and say, yeah, I look back and here's some mistakes that I made. Here's some things that I wish I would have done differently. In fact, sometimes you'll learn more from some of that. We've got to teach younger people the truths of this passage. And then here's the last thing I'll say. I want to challenge you based on everything we've said so far to remember that you get one shot at each stage of life. Teenagers, you get one shot at your teenage years. Enjoy them and live them to the glory of God. For those of you who are in your 20s, man, that's a fun phase of life. You get one shot at your 20s. Enjoy them and live them to the glory of God. Here's what Paul says. In fact, I'll back up here a little bit. Paul comes to near the end of his life. Well, he's in jail. He doesn't know if he's going to live or die. And in Philippians chapter 1, he says, if I die, that's better. To die is gain. For me to live as Christ, to die is gain. If I am to depart and be with Christ, man, that's far better, he says. But then he adds this, if I get to live on in the flesh, verse 22, that means fruitful labor for me. You see, for Paul, it wasn't just about living on so he could enjoy life. Part of living life to the glory of God and making the most of his life meant that whatever phase of life he was in, no matter how easy or difficult it meant he could bear fruit for God. And I want to challenge all of you, regardless of the stage of life you're in, your stage of life is an opportunity to bear fruit for Jesus Christ. I don't care if you're a teenager or you're 90. You still can and are called to bear fruit for the Lord. So again, I'll say it again. You get one shot at each stage of life. Teenagers, one shot. 20s, you get one shot. Enjoy it. If you're in your 30s, you get one shot at your 30s in that stage of life, whatever that looks like. Enjoy it and live it to the glory of God. And since really it's only the 30s and down who would get this, you don't want to throw away your shot, all right? And then the older of you are like, I don't get that. So let me go to the older ones now. If you're in your 40s and 50s, you get one shot at your 40s and 50s. Live it to the glory of God. If in your 60s or 70s or 80s or beyond, you get one shot at that phase of life. Don't waste it. Enjoy it, make the most of it, and live it to the glory of God. So what do you do with Ecclesiastes 11 and 12? Boy, it's kind of weird, right? You probably weren't expecting this sermon today. It's kind of a weird passage. But I think it's a reminder to all of us, specifically to the younger generation, but to all of us, that we must embrace and enjoy life as a gift from our Creator, because that's exactly what it is. And so whatever stage of life you find yourself in right now, live it for Jesus, because He's the one that makes any of this possible. Live it for Him. Don't waste it. You get one shot. Make the most of it and live it for the glory of God. If we can help you, won't you come as we stand and sing together?
Stay